So now he's going to take the tabernacle away from them. Why would he take something that they were supposed to go worship at away from them? Because they weren't going to it and worshiping. There was only a few that would bother to even show up at Shiloh on the festival days. On the 3 festival days commanded by God, by his word, they wouldn't even show up. They weren't there. They weren't there to give their sacrifice. They weren't there to let the priests do what God wanted them to do. So he abandoned the dwelling place at Shiloh, the tent which he had pitched among men, and gave his strength to captivity. That's coming. Captivity. Babylon, the shadow that Joel actually talks about. And his glory into the hand of the adversary. The Philistines first, and then on to Assyria, and then on to Babylon. And gave up his strength to captivity and his glory in the hand of the adversary. He also delivered his people to the sword and was filled with wrath at his inheritance. Who was his inheritance? Israel, the people of God. He was angry at them. He was angry at them to the point where he let them be overran by their enemies. This is what Joel is given a type of. This is what Joel is prophesying concerning. Remember, a prophecy is usually something that's going to happen down the road. The 3 generations that my wife talked about, that Joel talks about, that would be somewhere between 120 to 150 years. If you use that as a reality, you could put this probably 150 years or more before Babylon actually takes Jerusalem into captivity. This is how I'm going to actually say when the book was written. And I think it's got merit compared to some of the other ways people decide when the book was written, because he gives 3 generations before that shadow would take place, or that captivity would take place of Babylon. So what do we have? Jeremiah 7, 1 through 20. You can read that on your own, but again, this talks about losing Shiloh and the tent being burnt down. It talks about the fact that God is going to bring this severe wrath and judgment upon them because they have first abandoned him. So if God abandons them, but they first abandon him, who's at fault?
The ones who abandoned God.
Yeah, the ones that abandoned first, obviously. All right, so Joel is talked about by history way back to the early or mid 700s. I'm putting him in this general area here before Isaiah, and some put him as late as the 70 years of captivity in between the first and second captivity that goes out of Jerusalem. In any case, whatever that is, this is the warning to the people. This is the warning that God wants them to take seriously. And he's going to show them that warning in a real way. The real way will be what again? The devastation, what? The devastation of a locust invasion. Have you ever been in a locust invasion? Have you ever seen one?
On film.
On film only? Yes. We actually lived through one. We had a nice home with thousands of dollars worth of landscaping and beautiful stuff around our house. And when it was over, there was nothing outside alive. Other than the dog, maybe. They even ate the paint off of our house on the north side. You couldn't walk outside without crunching. They were everywhere. You couldn't do anything. The road leading from our house had 2 red stripes down the middle, where the blood from all these locusts had been ran over by cars. It was the most devastating thing I ever lived through. It lasted about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Okay, she says 6 weeks. She's got a better memory than I do. Yes, it was a miserable mess. We had a cat that used to go outside and then pick through the ones she wanted and then eat them. But she couldn't possibly eat them all. She just picked the ones she wanted. This devastation that he describes, I believe, was real. I believe it happened in the nation. I believe they lost their crops. I believe they lost everything. Can you imagine if you're a country that lives by farming, you survive by what you're able to raise, and then in just a few weeks, it's totally taken away from you. Everything. What do you feed yourself? What do you feed your family? What do you feed your animals? What do you feed? You have no feed. And it's going to be this way for probably the better part of a year or two, because you can't bring things back that fast. The devastation is going to be real, and it's going to be overwhelming. But the prophet Joel is using it in a reminder of a coming shadow that's going to be much greater than those locusts for a few weeks. And that's going to be the overwhelming devastation of the nation of Israel. Judah specifically, because he's a prophet to Judah, the 2 tribes to the south. Remember, the 10 tribes to the north go first. Assyria comes in and takes them away, wipes them out, takes them to a foreign land. They never come back. Judah will exist for a period of time, and then Babylon will come in and take them away. They will take them away, but of course through Darius and Cyrus, the Medo-Persians, God will allow them to come back as they begin the concept of the understanding that Jesus will come through the lineage of Israel, and Israel will be reestablished at that point in time. All right. Yes, please.
I don't want to sound like I'm illiterate in the Bible, but when this was prophesied, Joel prophesied, did he prophesize it all at once, or did he do it over a certain amount of time?
Don't know.
Okay.
We don't know. We know eventually was written down, probably all at once. But remember, prophets were first what? Verbal, just like preaching is verbal. God said in Corinthians, Paul did, that the world will be saved by the foolishness of the gospel preached. They did the same thing through the prophets. The prophets would speak verbally first for a period of time, and then these things will get written down for our learning so that they will be held in posterity. So, yes, I will make Jerusalem like Shiloh, is what the prophet tells us, Jeremiah. What happened to Shiloh? It's out of here. It's burnt down. It's gone. They don't have it anymore. What's going to happen to Jerusalem? Same thing. He's going to burn it down. And they need to have that understanding. Were there any righteous to be found?
Yes.
What were they called?
Remnant.
The remnant. That's right. They're called the remnant. Those that God knew were righteous. Remember, Elijah thought he was the only one, and what did God tell him? All right. So the idol worship to the Baals, and there were many different idols. Baal simply means an idol god. Elijah thought everybody had bowed the knee to Baal except him, and God said, I have over 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Did he feel better? Probably. But then 7,000 out of 5 or 6 million? How many is that? What's the percentage? Yeah, it's not very great, is it? So Israel was in trouble, and God prophesied it through prophets like Joel. All right, so Joel, if he's during that period of time, would be during the king Joash's time. Now, Joash was not a totally evil king, but he was not a good king either. He was kind of in between. He had some good, he had some evil. Nevertheless, Joel will prophesy during these periods of time, and he will show to Judah how God will. And of course, we've been studying Isaiah, which is that prophet that shows how, in more detail, God will deal with Israel. All right, let's talk a little more about this locust. God calls them soldiers of God's wrath. I call them soldiers of God's wrath, I guess. What's a soldier do?
Defender of a kingdom.
Okay, he follows the orders of a king, does he not? Sure, yeah. Is a locust following the orders of a king?
Yes.
Who? God. Can God actually talk to insects?
Well, he created them, so why not?
Yes. He can give them orders. He can send them. Remember when the people of Israel were in the wilderness and they wanted meat, what showed up? Thousands and thousands of quail all at once. Who did that? God did that. Just like he's doing with the locusts that he brought in. These things are determined by the power of God. Now, when I say talk to, I'm not caring whether he can actually have his voice heard by them. What he can do is cause them to do his will. Are animals or insects sometimes smarter than we are?
I work for the Humane Society.
Is the moon and the stars and the sun smarter than we are?
Yes.
How?
God tells them.
They always listen to God and follow his plan. Now, we say, well, that doesn't make any sense. They're inanimate objects. They have to follow God's plan. Do they? Do they? Who set them in motion? Who keeps them in motion? God, by the hand of Jesus Christ, according to Colossians chapter 2. Jesus holds everything together. Everything together. That means that all these inanimate objects that do exactly what God has them to do. Every day that sun comes up and it goes down. Every day that moon does the cycle that it's supposed to. Yes?
That's why when we pray to God, we thank him for another day.
Sure.
For the sun.
Absolutely.
rain.
Yes. Because he not only created them, he holds them together. He directs them. He's absolute in all these things. Should we thank him for directing them to our good? I think we should. Absolutely we should. All right, so here's what Joel says about these locusts that he's going to send that are a type or a shadow. What the gnawing locust has left, you know that locust, that first group of them that comes through? Is there anything left? Oh yeah, there's something left. They haven't killed everything yet. What the gnawing locust has left, the swarming locust has eaten. And what the swarming locust has left, the creeping locust has eaten. And what the creeping locust has left, the stripping locust has eaten. What's going to be left after the trinity of these three locusts? Nothing. Nothing.
So there are four kinds of locusts.
In this case, there were three different kinds of locusts, yes. And in our case, just from my own experience, at the end of what seemed to be the invasion that went on forever, as it's going on in real time, there was a pine tree in the front of our house that was still alive. And we thought, wow, that's great. At least something didn't get killed. And within 2 days, the locusts had surrounded the trunk of the pine tree and sucked all the sap out of it till it was dead. The tree died immediately. They didn't need a single needle off that tree. They didn't like the needles, but they loved the sap, the life that was in the trunk of the tree. Yes, they ate our oleanders and didn't die. All right, so he burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, 2 Kings 25:9, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every great house he burned with fire. This is the second shadow that's coming. This is the shadow of Babylon that's coming. This is what the locusts represent. This is what you need to understand. The people that went through the locust devastation, would it imprint on their minds the horror of it? Of course it would. And they were supposed to tell it to their sons, and their sons were supposed to tell it to their sons. 3 generations were supposed to remember this, because this is going to represent what takes place in Jerusalem. Was Jerusalem totally destroyed by Babylon? It was. Totally. Destroyed by Babylon. There was nothing but rubble left when Babylon got done. And the fire consumed the remainder of what they didn't tear down. Joel chapter 1, the locusts, Babylon are both. For a nation has invaded my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and it has fangs of a lioness. It has made my vine a waste, and my fig tree splinters. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become white. What does a white branch represent? Death. It's dead. Everything is dead. You can't look around and find anything that's alive in vegetation. It's gone. It's dead. Wail like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. What would it be like for a young lady to mourn the death of her husband? That's the kind of mourning that's going to happen to Israel at the wrath of God. Why? Can you imagine the people? Would the people be asking, why, God? Why? Of course they would. Would they actually know deep down inside them why? Conscience, yes, right. How bad did they get?
They must have been really bad.
Well, we know that during Josiah's time they lost the law, so they weren't following the law of God. We know that they had taken on all kinds of different rituals of idols. Were the rituals of idols evil?
Yes.
Sure. Were they immoral?
Yes.
Absolutely they were immoral. They even, this is the one that, I don't know, it always bothers me, and it probably doesn't bother others as much, but they even set up male prostitutes in the temple. The temple of God had available to those that would come to it male and female prostitutes, just like the idol temples did. Is that the morality of God? Is that what the law of God talked about? Or had they gone so far that God didn't even recognize them? Ezekiel speaks about God leaving the temple. He says he first got up and left the holy place. And then he crossed the threshold of the temple. And then eventually he went out one of the gates of Jerusalem. And he did that in 3 different sections so the people would have an understanding of what? What do you think?
That he did not agree with what was going on.
Of course, that he did not agree and he thought it was bad, but he was patient. He kept waiting, and he kept waiting, and he kept waiting. He wanted them to change. He wanted them to repent. He kept sending prophet after prophet after prophet, like Joel, like Isaiah, like Habakkuk, like Amos, all these different prophets that came to warn the people. He kept sending them and sending them, but they weren't what? They weren't listening. They weren't repenting. They weren't changing. They weren't doing anything other than getting worse. And when God left, he sent, of course, the enemies of Israel to destroy them. And in destroying them, he wanted them to understand what had to take place. In the locusts again, the grain offering, the drink offering, they're all cut off. They're cut off from the house of the Lord as well. Think about that for a minute. Were there certain things that required the first fruits of the land to be offered to God as a sacrifice? Yes, there were. They had to have 12 loaves of showbread. How could you make 12 loaves of showbread if your wheat is gone or barley is gone? You couldn't make those. They wouldn't exist. The various different grain offerings, the offerings of the oil, which was olive oil, and the olive trees now dead. Could you do those for the Lord anymore? You couldn't do those either for the Lord anymore, could you? The reason that God didn't care whether they had them anymore is because in the heart of conscience, they weren't offering them in the way God wanted them. They just doing a ritual. God says, do this, they did it. They didn't care what they were doing, they just did it. Can we ever become people of ritual without our heart into it?
Isn't it in Micah where he says that I would rather have your heart than the sacrifice?
Yes. Also in Malachi, he says, you go and get the blind animal to give to me. You get the lame one for me. You get the one that you're culling out of your field that you didn't want, and you bring to me as a sacrifice. And then he says, would you offer that to your governor? Would you offer that to your fleshly leader? Why would you do that to God? They had lost so much respect and glory for God. They had given up everything that God had made special to them in himself and his ways. They had just gotten to a point where God was a byword to them.
What was wrong with them?
What gets wrong with us sometimes? Do people carve out of their life a sin that they like and think that God will ignore it? Can you do that? Not and please God, you can't do it. But I've known many that have. God has laws. He has morality, His rules. He has His word. He expects us to be the people of that, not to be the people against that. When Israel had become against God's will, when Israel had begun to do things that God couldn't accept, God had no choice but to discipline them. The discipline of God comes upon His people. Joel and Amos talk about this. The Lord roars from Zion, He utters His voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth tremble. Why didn't the people tremble?
Because they were no longer afraid.
There was no fear of God left, no reverent respect. Amos, the Lord roars from Zion and from Jerusalem. He utters His voice, and the shepherd's pasture grounds mourn, and the summit of Carmel dries up. God's going to bring discipline.
Rick?
Yes.
One thing I don't understand, didn't these people at that time have a sense of wrong and right?
Nope. Not in the sense that God had written it down, they didn't. No, they'd given it up. They had other gods now. Those other gods had given them information they thought that was better than the God they had previously. And who doesn't want a God that says, you can go do anything you want?
I would know He wasn't a true God.
You would, wouldn't you? You would think. But unfortunately, people have religions like that today, don't they? It's all feel good. It's all love of God. And you can go do anything you want. God doesn't care. He loves you, by the way. We're out of time. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
That was really informative.
Thank you.